Let me first thank the Philosophical Faculty of Comenius University for having invited me, especially Professor Wisnowski, and I also would like to take the chance to thank Lubomir Dunjaj, who has prepared my visit to Bratislava, which I'm enjoying very much. So the title of my lecture is Education and the Democratic Public Sphere, a neglected chapter of political philosophy. Ever since its beginnings in the 19th century, the history of the public education system in democratic constitutional states has been a series of conflicts over the structure, form, and content of the instruction provided in schools. Neither the stratification of the school system nor the teaching methods or the curricula remained unaffected by the disputes between state agencies on the one side and representatives of social groups or parents' associations on the other. The state's recognition of a right on the part of each citizen to receive an education had an explosive potential, which Kant may have anticipated in the following sentence from his lectures on pedagogy. And I quote Kant, "Two human inventions can probably be regarded as the most difficult, namely the arts of government and education. And yet there is still controversy about their very idea." End of quote. That's from Kant's lectures on pedagogy. For Kant, the parallel between the art of government and the art of education was suggested by the fact that both are socially created practices fulfilling the same function, albeit in the distinct dimensions of species history and individual history, phylogeny and ontogeny. Through the prudent choice of means and methods, which is to say in an artful way, both pedagogy and the art of government, which means political philosophy, both are meant to instruct us on how to effect a transition from a state of minority to a state of freedom, be it with regard to a whole people consisting of individual subjects, or be it with regard to a child still subjected to the rule of nature within itself. What initially looks like a mere analogy is developed far beyond that in the course of Kant's lectures, where he points out that education and a republican political order mutually presuppose each other. The young human being, governed by nature, has to undergo an educational process aimed at freedom before he can become a member of a self-governing political community. Conversely, only autonomous citizens are able to institutionalize a system of public education that enables their children to attain political maturity. Good upbringing and a republican political order require each other because the former, in the form of public education, first produces the cultural and moral capacities that make it possible for the latter to exist and thrive in such a way that the active citizen even take an interest in the political emancipation of the lower rungs of society. As in Rousseau's Emile, Kant's pedagogy draws on the idea of the good citizen as a link between educational theory and the theory of government, between a conception of upbringing and political philosophy. Neither could exist without the other, since both spell out inseparable preconditions of a democratic political community. It is this very close, internal or even conceptual interrelation that explains why within the political and philosophical discourse of modernity, virtually no notable theorist of democracy has failed to offer a systematic contribution to educational theory. Beginning with Rousseau and Kant, through Schleiermacher, and up to Emil Durkheim and John Dewey, numerous important thinkers found it natural to devote entire books to the subject of public education. They thought of pedagogy, conceived as the theory of the standards and methods of the adequate teaching of children, as the twin sister of democratic theory. Without proper instructions about how to render a child both capable of cooperation and morally independent, it seemed to them impossible to explain what it could mean to speak of the joint undertaking of democratic self-determination. The idea of the good citizen was not an empty phrase or an ornament for political speeches, but a practical challenge asking for the theoretical elaboration and even the experimental testing of suitable school types and teaching methods. Thus, when it came to the challenge of rehabituating an entire population, the population of Germany, to the practices of democratic politics that had been systematically eradicated under National Socialism, the American occupying forces found it natural to draw on the pedagogical writings of John Dewey in the early 1950s. So it is famously known that when the American forces came into Germany to overcome National Socialism, they started very soon a program of political reform to re-educate a whole population. It's called the re-education period of German politics. And this re-education system was based on the writings of John Dewey. So John Dewey became enormously important for the pedagogy in Germany, West Germany, after 1950 up until 1960 almost. And the period is the re-education period. The ties between democratic theory and pedagogical practice were still so close, and the internal relation between them still appeared so obvious, that the project of teaching democratic manners to the demoralized citizens of a thoroughly destroyed criminal state was not perceived as objectively paternalistic. Since then, however, the conceptual link between democracy and education and between political philosophy and pedagogy has been weakened. To be sure, efforts are still made to reinvigorate theoretical reflection on democratic education. But nowadays, these efforts tend to come from a pedagogical discourse abandoned by philosophers. These philosophers, are no longer at the center of political philosophy itself. No, these discourses on pedagogical discourse are no longer in the center of political philosophy itself. Democratic theory, in all its manifold guises and voices, tends to be silent on the pedagogical aspect of its domain. It has nothing to offer with regard to either the methods or the subject matter of primary and secondary education. In the present, political philosophy seems to have lost the insight that a thriving democracy must continually reproduce the cultural and moral preconditions of its own existence by way of general educational processes. These remarks on the intimate relation between education on the one hand and political freedom and democracy on the other are merely preliminary, and while I will elaborate them in more detail in the second part of my talk, before I do that, I will try to, in the first part of my talk, to venture an explanation for the decoupling between pedagogy and political philosophy. It will turn out that the reasons for this development have to do with confluence of two causes that have, as it were, an elective affinity with each other. First, certain problematic conceptions of the cultural presuppositions of democracy. Second, a misunderstanding of the idea of the neutrality of the state. After making my case for the rapprochement, both in negative and in positive terms, I proceed in a third step to outline the challenges faced by a reinvigorated program of democratic education. Since an extended treatment of this last point would require much more time than what is available for this talk, I will limit myself to some brief remarks. So this lecture has three parts. In the first part, I will investigate into the possible causes for this growing separation between political philosophy and democratic education. Second part will be on this internal or even conceptual link between pedagogy and democracy. And third part will be about more, let's say, practical questions of how to think about education if you have it as being the twin sister of democratic theory. So first part, whereas Kant, Durkheim and Dewey considered the topic of democratic education an intrinsic part of their respective projects in political philosophy, its role in contemporary normative democratic theory has become a marginal one. It is still occasionally mentioned, and introductory texts sometimes identify it as a part of the general subject matter of political philosophy. But its proper delimitation and development is left purely to educational theory. Democratic theory has uncoupled itself from its twin sister, the study of the adequate organization and method of democratic education, and it has thereby deprived itself of the chance to make a proper contribution regarding the normative functions of preschool, primary and secondary education and adult education. Some might rest content with observing that this development simply reflects a more general differentiation of scientific disciplines over the course of the past 200 years. Just as philosophy in the second half of the 19th century parted ways with social theory, which then established itself as the discipline of sociology, so too the increasing specialization of philosophy required it to withdraw from the project of determining the educational processes required for the development of major democratic politics. But it is quite apparent that things are not so simple when one considers that political philosophy constantly encounters the problem of education without having so much as the beginnings of a solution to it. With the political entrenchment of compulsory education, state-administered schooling has become a crucial instrument for forming the habits and abilities of each new generation, influencing future citizens either for the better or for the worse. The type, methods and contents of school education may affect democracy either in positive ways, for example by fostering cooperativeness and individual self-esteem, or in negative ones, gradually undermining democracy by teaching moral conformism and unquestioning obedience to authority. Thus, the question regarding the proper kind of state-mandated education has been at the heart of political philosophy from its very inception. Just think of Plato's Republic. And serious reflection on the question how a state or political community should be constituted given the fundamental features of human nature had to confront the closely related question what and whom to teach and by what methods to do so. The fact that these questions has nowadays largely vanished from political philosophy and is no longer being pursued by it in either positive or negative terms cannot be due simply to the thought that the topic can be more productively and more adequately pursued by a specialized discipline. The problem of state-organized education is far too central to political agency and far too consequential with regard to the possibility of democracy and the rule of law for it to be straightforwardly separable from the theory of philosophy of politics. If we wish to explain the current separation between democratic theory and educational theory, we must therefore look to causes other than the progressive differentiation of academic disciplines. I suspect that the explanation will be located at a more fundamental conceptual level having to do with the proper demarcation of the extent to which democracy is able to affect itself. As a rule of thumb, we can say that this extent will be more limited the less a democratic state is able to influence the conditions of its own existence, be it due to normative constraints or because of its operative limitations. When the space for self-generating activity on the part of the democratic state is conceived of as being quite confined, the political significance accorded to school education will be correspondingly reduced, since it is then no longer regarded as a powerful instrument of change. It seems to me that theoretical shifts of this sort, that is to say, a certain disillusionment about the self-generative powers of democratic communities, are primarily responsible for the fact that school education and its administration by the state receive only scant attention from political philosophers today. Let me mention two of the theoretical sources that may account for the fact that over the past few decades, democratic theory has unwittingly and through an almost imperceptible process lost its faith in the value that state-run education has for democracy. To be sure, one could cite other causes besides these, such as the observation that children's characters are formed through socialization in very early childhood and thus during a developmental phase on which the state has little purchase. But I will restrict myself to the following two aspects, since they fall squarely within the domain of political philosophy, properly speaking. First, the idea that the liberal democratic state has only very limited ability to regenerate the moral and cultural resources on which it relies itself may owe its currency in part to the view defended by the German constitutional lawyer Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde, and therefore often referred to as the Böckenförde theorem in the German discussion. And this view of Böckenförde wants to say that a democratic state depends for its reproduction on a supply of cultural traditions that themselves precede democracy. That's an enormous important thesis. Meanwhile, in democratic theory, the core idea is those cultural potentialities and those cultural preconditions on which a democracy is depending are generated by conditions which are before democracy. So pre-democratic cultural resources. Also, Böckenförde seems originally to have intended this view in a rather narrow sense as pertaining to the ethical preconditions for the functioning of modern legal systems. His thesis is nowadays given a much broader interpretation and is taken to speak to the cultural dependency of democratic constitutional states quite generally. On this more general reading, democratic political systems require the cultural support of ethical customs and habits whose cultivation and flourishing these systems themselves lack the means to promote. At the most general level, the so-called Böckenförde theorem is even taken to assert that democracies owe their social survival to the existence of moral attitudes that can thrive only in traditional-orientated communities governed by substantial ethical or even religious conceptions. Once this last view is adopted, it is only a short step to the conclusion that state-run educational processes, that is to say school and preschool education, lack any value for the formation of democratic habits and attitudes. For whatever moral attitudes facilitate cooperative political decision-making, tolerance, empathy, a concern for the common good, they are acquired not as a response to school teaching, no matter how well thought out, but solely through processes of ethical socialization within pre-political communities. The idea is mainly that it are either the families or the let's say ethically very thick communities which produce those habits and virtues which are necessary for democracy. These virtues everyone agrees upon: tolerance, empathy, concern for the common good. But the main thesis, meanwhile, is that these virtues can't be produced by democracy itself, but only by certain arenas before democracy, so families or communities, thick communities, to which the state has no access. So the state can't influence how families are living or can't influence the ethical communities. Therefore, it can't reproduce its own cultural preconditions. Whereas in Böckenförde, there are at least some hints that, and I quote, education and schooling are capable of fulfilling the relevant functions, the common receptions of his view reduce it to the claim that democratic societies are forced to rely on the survival of tradition-based ethical communities. All efforts on the part of the state to ensure a general democratic education are thought to be in vain, since they are held to be unable to generate the ethical virtues whose existence is vital to the continued functioning of any democracy. The increasingly widespread adoption of this view within political philosophy, I think it's the same in the United States, where you have exactly the same development. The increasingly widespread adoption of this view within political philosophy is likely to be one of the factors that have led recent democratic theory to avoid questions regarding public education. Such questions are bound to appear irrelevant to the extent to which it is assumed that democratic dispositions are acquired not through state-mediated educational processes, but rather in the pre-political environments furnished by tradition-oriented communities. Yet the popular version of the Böckenförde thesis is not the only reason that accounts for the increasing distance that contemporary democratic theory takes from its twin sister, educational theory. The tendency just described is met from another, more normative direction by the tendency to construe the idea of state neutrality in such a restrictive way that even the principles of democratically organized collective decision-making are no longer permitted to shape public school education. Just like the culturally conservative reinterpretation of democracy, according to which the latter can survive only thanks to a supply of cultural traditions that precede it, so too the radicalization of the ideal of state neutrality has taken place, as it were, behind the backs of political philosophers rather than having been consciously intended by them. It may even be that this second theoretical shift has been an unintended consequence of a well-intentioned effort to accommodate the increasing plurality of ethnic and religious cultures within contemporary society by emphasizing the strict impartiality of state-administered education. Of course, the degree of state neutrality has always been subject to changes in political attitude that reflect, albeit in complex ways, the ethical convictions of a majority and thereby a variable balance of social power. Ultimately, the only constraint on the legitimacy of a political entrenchment of substantive values is simply that the universalist principles of democratic constitutions must not thereby be violated. In the long-standing debate over the inevitable partiality of the state's activity, the tradition from Kant to Durkheim and Dewey that I identified earlier took it for granted that state-administered education should embody exactly those values that had led to the decision to make such education compulsory for all future citizens in the first place. The right of the parents to impart to their children their own particular values had to end at the school entrance, so that the pupils could then practice the reflective habits that would enable them to take part in the process of joint public decision-making. But if it once appeared completely natural for school teaching to be geared towards the very democratic procedures that were operative in making it obligatory in the first place, doubts are increasingly voiced today. Some appeal to the constraint of state neutrality to caution against overburdening school education with political values alien to its purpose. Others, for example concerned parents, complain that too much emphasis on the theme of democracy might get it in the way of promoting career skills. When well-worn reservations of this kind meet with unexpected public support owing to the growth of multiculturalism, which does in fact speak in favor of removing certain ideological relics from our schools, we encounter the vague mixture of truth and falsehoods that gives rise to the rejection of all forms of partiality in school education as equally harmful or objectionable. The political constraint of state neutrality is then extended to the point where even the very idea of a democratic education is no longer a matter of normative common sense. That's a strange development in Western Europe, that let's say the fight for multiculturalism includes the idea that the public schools shouldn't include cultural values. You have this debate in France about the republic school system. You have the same debates in Germany about to what degree schools are allowed to have, let's say, religious symbols. This fight is very progressive, and it means you shouldn't have in schools those particular cultural values. But this debate, meanwhile, goes so far that a public school, seems not even to be allowed to represent democratic values. You see, that's a paradoxical development in the Western debate. And I think it's completely absurd, but it is especially that parents now, interested parents, interested in the career of their children, take up this argument, are fighting for multiculturalism, but these are bourgeois parents, yeah? But at the same time saying, don't include democratic values in the school system, because that's one other more value. And our children should be raised value-free. So, and because democratic values could imply that there is no longer enough observation of the specific cognitive skills, therefore we should get rid of it. To be sure, these radicalized conceptions of state neutrality have not yet become pervasive in contemporary political philosophy. There is an ongoing debate about how to properly adapt this part of the legacy of liberal political thought to the increasing heterogeneity of cultural values in present-day societies. But when we take into account the culturally conservative reinterpretations of the survival conditions of democracy I described earlier, we can discern a theoretical development that may well result in the view that the methods and contents of state-administered education must be purged of all democratic codes. This is the direction indicated, for example, by proposals that schools should be in charge only of an educational, I quote, civic minimum, that parents should be given vouchers allowing them to choose educational options with this or that specific ideological tendency, and that teachers should no longer be considered as state agents, but rather as answerable solely to the parents. Huge debate in Germany and in the United States. Are teachers agents of the state, or are teachers agents for the parents? But the further such considerations are taken, however tentative they may at first be, and the more public schools thus come to be thought of as subject to the constraint of ethical neutrality, in juxtaposition with the plurality of ethically committed private schools, the greater becomes the threat to one of the very instruments that a democratic society has at its disposal to regenerate its own ethical foundations. In this way, conflicts over a state-run school system, regardless of whether they concern its structure, curriculum, or methods, are always at the same time conflicts over the sustainability of democracy. No philosophical tradition was more aware of this nexus than the one initiated by Kant and culminating in the work of Durkheim and Dewey. So I come to my second part. The considerations I have advanced so far have been of a negative kind. The criticism of some tendencies in contemporary democratic theory has already revealed the premises on which we will have to rely if we are looking to understand the public school system as a necessary complement of democratic decision-making, and in fact as an integral and prior part of it. We have seen that we must neither sacrifice the guiding hypothesis that it is possible for education to foster the capacity for public deliberation even outside the specific contexts of early childhood socialization and traditional ethical communities, nor jeopardize the authority of the constitutional state to infuse democratic goals into the educational structures it sets up. Viewed from a positive angle, we can say that foremost among the tasks of a democratic constitutional state is the task to provide educational opportunities that will equally enable each of its future citizens to participate in the public legitimation of his or her own choices without fear or shame. This quote, "without fear or shame," is from Adam Smith, who wants to say that one of the main, let's say one of the main, how you say that? One of the main talents a citizen has to have is to appear in public without shame or anxiety, or fear and shame. In Kant's treatise on education, which was strongly influenced by Rousseau's Emile, without following it in every respect, this general idea results only in a defense of public education, accessible to all, against the champions of domestic education. The advantage of the former, public education, according to Kant, is that it can foster in each pupil the virtues and capacities of a future citizen, while sidestepping the danger, and I quote from Kant, of perpetuating family defects. Everything that such educational processes are meant to impart, first, mechanical skills, second, pragmatic prudence, third, moral autonomy, is subordinate, in Kant's view, to the goal of creating within the individual a corresponding number of layers of self-respect and self-esteem, which taken together allow him to act with self-confidence as citizen of a republic. The question of how these three sets of pedagogically imparted abilities are supposed to contribute to the exercise of a profession in adult age does not arise here at all, since all these abilities are considered solely for the contribution they make to an individual's acquisition of various kinds of self-esteem. Kant anticipates a famous thought found in the work of John Rawls when he maintains that a future citizen must first and foremost have access to the key good of self-respect before he is able to participate in republican self-legislation as an equal among equals. Professional skills, civic competence, and moral principles are here conceived of not primarily as teachable means for enabling individuals to secure an income for themselves, but rather as generalized media of school recognition, of social recognition, which the young acquire through a pedagogical process and which gradually make them aware of possessing a certain worth in the eyes of the other. By learning technical skills, the young person gains respect, and I quote Kant, with regard to himself as an individual. The acquisition of civic knowledge affords him public worth, as Kant is saying, as a citizen, and the acquisition of moral principles earns him the respect of the human mankind. Despite all this remarkable insight regarding the interrelation between general public education and reciprocal recognition within a republican political community, Kant is still quite far away from drawing conclusions with regard to the proper methods and organization of school teaching. He is thinking of the individual male pupil who is to develop self-esteem through the pedagogically mediated acquisition of knowledge, rather than of a cooperative community where each individual must, as a recognized member, be able to act in concert with all others for the purpose of joint decision-making. While at some points of his pedagogy, Kant senses that a republic has a much greater need for fostering the communicative virtues than for simply imparting knowledge, he still recoils from the consequence of identifying the public school first and foremost as a place where democratic capacities are formed. This step is taken about 100 years later by Emil Durkheim and John Dewey, both of whom seek in their works to elucidate the internal relation between education and democracy, between learning at school and becoming a democratic citizen. Even though the basic assumption made by each of these two thinkers appear to be in deep conflict with the others, on the one side, the sociologist Durkheim with scientific inclinations. On the other, Dewey, the vocal exponent of pragmatism in philosophy. Their reflections on democratic education share a surprising range of features. Among the three functions that a contemporary perspective would attribute to education in primary and secondary schools: to provide essential qualifications for entering a profession, to compensate educational deficits stemming from family or social background, and to offer a general preparation for the role of citizens, Durkheim and Dewey focus exclusively on the last. So they are not stressing so much qualification for a profession. They are not aware of the role or function of schools with respect to compensating deficits of very early family situation or social background, but they are only concentrating on the role of schools for the general preparation for the role of citizens. Just as it had been for Kant, the acquisition of professional knowledge is for them just a side product of the training of democratic dispositions. And the task of educational compensation is considered to lie with the individual community that is each particular school. In justifying the state's authority to obligate the tax-funded educational system to generate civic capacities, both thinkers advance similar arguments. If it is granted that the introduction of compulsory schooling by the state can be conceived as a democratically legitimate act, only when it is interpreted as joint civic effort to equally enable all citizens to exercise their political rights, it is not cogent to then abrogate the state's right to use school teaching to train the requisite abilities and practices. Yet such considerations at the level of democratic theory constitute only the general framework within which Durkheim and Dewey developed their more detailed studies regarding the content and structure of school education. Here again, we find significant parallels between their respective arguments. Their point of departure is the thesis that to prepare for the role of citizen is less a matter of acquiring the right kind knowledge than it is a matter of acquiring certain practical habits. What the pupil should learn in school is not primarily testable knowledge of political or historical facts, but rather modes of conduct that enable self-confident action as part of a cooperative community. It may not come as a particular surprise that the pragmatist John Dewey was led in this direction and came to view schools above all as a place in which a public engages in communal inquiry. But how it is that a similar line is taken by Emil Durkheim, who likewise looks at schools for how they can train the capacity for democratic cooperation, is something that I will need to briefly elaborate on. In contrast with Dewey, who was much more optimistic in this regard, Durkheim is initially guided by the Kantian idea that a child's innately egoistic inclinations need to be curbed by moral discipline before it can learn to autonomously conform to the social rules of a democratic community. Yet he departs from his philosophical teacher Kant in picturing this preparatory educational process as proceeding more smoothly and with greater chances of success the more it engages the child's passions and desires. That is to say, her sensible nature, for example, by drawing on practical role models and playful activity. Thus, for Durkheim, the overcoming of infantile egoism is not in fact a process of moral discipline, even though he repeatedly describes it as such. It is rather a process of effective habituation. By participating in practices that are adequate to her in that they engage in her inclinations, the child initially comes to master on a merely habitual level the rules of democratic existence that it should later, with increasing age, comprehend in their rational validity. With regard to schools and their style of education, the conclusions that Durkheim reaches on the basis of these revisions of Kant's view are almost the same ones at which Dewey arrives from his quite different Hegelian premises. Through cooperative learning, through active participation in all the school's affairs, and through communal rather than individualized kinds of rebuke and encouragement, pupils should be habituated early on to acquire the spirit of democratic cooperation that will allow them in adult age to represent themselves with self-confidence in the public political arena. Thus, neither of the two thinkers shares the view commonly taken today that the primary goal of school attendance is the development of individual autonomy. Instead, their models of education are shaped by the idea that the pupil should be provided with a reliable sense of what it means to treat their fellow pupils as equal partners in a shared process of learning and inquiry. If a public school has the task of engendering in such successive generation the practical dispositions that are vital for the possibility of democratic decision-making, then it must aim at habituating those it seeks to educate into a culture of association. That's Dewey's formulation, the culture of association, rather than just at imparting to them a grasp of moral principles. The crucial contribution that school education can make to the regeneration of democracy lies not in teaching individual rules of right action, but in a communicative practice that fosters moral initiative and the ability to take up the perspective of others. We should, of course, note that not only 100 years pass between Kant's lectures on pedagogy and the arguments just presented. Another 100 years have passed since then. In view of this long interval, some may shake their heads and triumphantly point out that along with the social and economic conditions, the requirements on schooling too have radically changed. The greatly increased number of pupils, the economic demand for flexibility and motivation, the educational deficits that despite many efforts persist in the lower segments of society, all this seem to leave highly developed capitalist countries with no other choice but to place increasing emphasis in school teaching on selectivity, individualized assessment, and the encouragement of competitive behavior. In the United States, politicians, economic experts, and managers are already calling for a thorough, thorough-going reform of the entire education system, proposing measures whose cumulative effect it would be to make teaching entirely subservient to the goal of transmitting marketable skills. According to these proposals, the effectiveness of all American schools should be subject to ongoing quantitative comparison, where the success of individual teachers is measured by their students' placement in nationally standardized tests. Controlling procedures of this kind, which sooner or later would have the effect of marginalizing all subjects not amenable to statistical evaluation, are discussed not only in the United States but also in Europe, as though here too one were hoping to subject schools to the dictate of economic developments by employing measurement methods familiar from the financial sector. Given these circumstances, there might seem to be little point in recalling times when public education was regarded as the linchpin of democratic self-renewal. Not only democratic theory, but politics itself seems to have lost interest in the only kind of institution that is suited to constantly regenerate, albeit tentatively and with great effort, the fragile preconditions of a people's democratic decision-making. If these tendencies seem to point to the abandonment of the idea of a democratic education, they are at the same time contradicted by a multitude of empirical findings that have resulted from comparative education studies and from the PISA survey over the past several years. These data marvelously illustrate what Durkheim and Dewey anticipated in their reflections a century ago, when they insisted on a close correlation between cooperative, democracy-oriented teaching methods on the one hand and pupils' performance at school on the other. The school system that consistently comes out on top in all international comparisons of scholastic achievement is the same one that comes closest to realizing the democratic ideals of the two thinkers. In Finnish schools, as is well known, pupils from different educational backgrounds remain in the same schools together as long as possible. Tests and examinations are reduced to a bare minimum. Communicative responsibility and mutual trust are given much greater weight than individual attributability. And choices regarding teaching methods are made by the professionally trained teachers themselves in cooperation with student representatives. It is true that description of the Finnish school system do not employ the terminology used by Durkheim and Dewey. There is no talk of habituation, nor of communal morality or cooperative methods or education. But such translations or retranslations into a language of democratic education could easily be supplied and would then reveal a case of the rare and fortunate situation where what is politically and normatively right coincides with what is pragmatically useful. The types of school education that are best with a view to pupils' cognitive achievements and abilities turn out to be those that are also most suited to the regeneration of democratic dispositions. In times when talk of growing political apathy is ubiquitous, and when some even speak of the threat of post-democracy, there is no reason whatsoever not to revive the tradition inaugurated by Kant, Durkheim and Dewey, and to conceive of public education as a crucial instrument for the self-reproduction of democracies. I come to the last very short point, so it will be over in 7 minutes. What I have been saying so far may have created the impression that, like the proper methods of democratic education, its contents too are fixed once and for all, removed from all historical change. Kant in particular played a part in suggesting such a view, since he tied the acquisition of the necessary forms of civic self-respect to the successive mastery of timelessly valid portions of knowledge. But Durkheim too exhibits a tendency to prescribe a certain fixed subject matter to all processes of cooperative education. Only John Dewey resists this tendency and soberly points out throughout his pedagogical writings that along with the various challenges that require public problem solving, the material to be taught in schools must also change. Like Durkheim, he believes that a hierarchical ordering of subjects is indispensable. Curiously, Dewey accords the highest rank to geography, first geography and then history. But what exactly it is that students should cooperatively learn in these disciplines is in his view determined by the historically changing tasks of democratic decision-making. Before I end my lecture, I would like, in a Deweyan spirit, to at least briefly name those two historical challenges whose consequences for our democratic coexistence create a particular need for adjustments in school curricula. In both cases, more detailed considerations would likely show that the challenges cannot be properly treated within the confines of any one individual subject, and that they should rather be addressed more or less across the entire range of the curriculum. For any observant person, there can be no doubt that the digital revolution of our communicative relations will lead to profound changes not only in the ways in which private relationships are initiated and maintained, but also with respect to the processes by which political views are formed. The Internet, which leads to both a spatialization, and an acceleration of each individual's interactions with others, is creating an ever more quickly growing number of web-based public spheres whose outer boundaries are in permanent flux. It is certainly a task of primary and secondary education to prepare school children both technologically and socially for the use of this new medium. But this will hardly exhaust the efforts required to address its historical consequences. It seems to me that it will be also necessary to jointly explore both the potential and the limits and dangers of the new medium by experimentally investigating how digitally disseminated topics and bodies of information are generated. For instance, by examining the genesis and quality of specific Wikipedia entries. Selective reconstructions of this sort would require the close cooperation of different subjects, since specific knowledge of the relevant fields would be needed over and above purely technical and economic expertise. This particular example has to suffice to illustrate the much broader idea that what is needed in our schools today is the ability not merely to use the Internet, but also to understand its specific mode of production and the range of its effects. In the spirit of John Dewey, the cooperative use of computers should prepare the pupils for the mature and responsible use of new instruments of political decision-making. The digital revolution is the first of the two historical challenges facing the democratic public today. The second one is the increasing heterogeneity of the population of Western countries. And with respect to the novel medium that is the Internet, so too, with regard to multiculturalism, few will disagree that schools have to do everything within their powers to prepare their pupils for these changes in the conditions under which public opinion is formed. But here again, we need to ask which pedagogical methods and contents will be best suited to this task. The idea of a democratic education that my talk has tried to recall to us offers an answer to the first part of this question regarding methods. The less a pupil is treated as an isolated subject meant to deliver a certain performance, and the more he or she is approached as a member of a cooperative learning community, the more likely is the emergence of forms of communication that allow not only for a playful acceptance of cultural differences, but that positively conceive of such differences as opportunities for mutual enrichment. But to point in this way to the power of democratic education to facilitate recognitive relationships does not yet answer the second part of our question concerning the consequences that the growth of multiculturalism should have for the content of what is taught. Let me close by suggesting that at present we cannot even adequately imagine what that content should look like 15 or 20 years from now, if fair and equal consideration is to be given to the cultural and ethnic composition of school classes. In order for those future pupils to grow into major participants in a highly heterogeneous and colorfully mixed public sphere, they will have to learn to approach history, literature, geography, and most other subjects from the same sort of decentralized perspective that we today are still struggling to gradually teach ourselves in the context of a number of academic disciplines. So, thank you very much.
I would like to thank Professor Honneth for his keynote lecture, in which he set the stage, because especially in this part of the world we have been discussing democracy in the past 20 years. But while discussing democracy, we have not been talking education. Now it looks like we should switch to education, but the question is about democracy. We will stop talking democracy. Now, this should be discussed in combination. We have agreed with Professor Honneth to conduct this discussion in English. So, we have plenty of time, about 20 minutes or more, and the floor is open for your questions, reactions. Here is one. The first one. Okay.
May I?
Yeah.
I have a question about a concrete issue which was raised a while ago in Germany. It was about the child's book, where the word neger was used, and this word, when this book was written, it simply meant the black person. Not this word was not used as a swear word like it is used in today's English, and why it was influenced now in today's German. So one black parent who was reading this child book to his daughter, he raised this issue, and quite a big controversy was created in Germany because of this. And well, this parent was simply suggesting that such kind of words, insulting words, politically incorrect words, should be changed, or something should be somehow should be dealt with. And I was actually shocked that publishing house agreed to this suggestion after some debates, of course, in the society, and they agreed to change this word. And I think it is closely related to the issue of education, informal education, democratic values, and multiculturalism, about which you were talking. I think this is absurd, and it simply cannot be viewed in the political correctness of the society, or whatever it is. I mean, should we revise Faust's work because of some words became politically incorrect, or I don't know, Marcel Proust's words because in his some of the words became politically incorrect, or Remarque's words, or I don't know, Garcia Marquez's words, etc., etc. Because I know that some of the words meant something else during the time when these books were created, these romans were created, and now they mean something else. And I actually think that this is absurd because of the fact that, well, modern neoliberal capitalistic society actually tries to somehow address some absurd, irrelevant issues, than to actually address the problem of social inequality, etc., etc., and somehow tries to push us in this direction of, I don't know, multiculturalism and political correctness, etc., etc. I would very much like to hear your view, your view on this issue, and also I would like to hear what would be, well, Habermastic viewpoint of this issue, if it is possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can't speak for Habermas. I mean, I don't know what he thinks about that. Let me first say that what I don't believe is with what you ended. What I don't believe is that this is almost this debate, you were addressing, that this debate is almost a kind of intentional product of let's say the capitalist system to make us unaware of the real substantial questions like social inequality. I think this whole debate and this specific example is to a certain degree a logical consequence of debates of multiculturalism and especially of post-colonialism. And in that sense, I think the debate as such is not something problematic. Yeah, the debate as such. And if you become aware within a long process of the fact that not only our institutions and not our let's say our social structure was repressing other ethnic perspectives or cultural groups, but also our language was reflecting that, then I think we are going through a necessary stage of reflecting on our language and linguistic practices. I think this is quite a good step to take, like we are proving now certain linguistic habits we had with respect to claims of multiculturalism or feminism. We are slowly, and you can't do that intentionally, but we are slowly reforming our linguistic practices. And this, I think, is a very important process. So, and it's clear now, we are not longer using, in the United States, they are not longer using the word Negro. Instead, they are using African American. I think that's important. And I think it's an important step of self-revisioning one's own practices. The same is true with regard to feminist questions. I think it's enormously important to overcome certain automatic words which automatically associate with women sexual objects, for example. So this all is important. Then the next step is, in the line of that, to bring up the question to which degree our former pedagogical instruments or literature, which means artistic forms of representation, were influenced by these linguistic practices. And then we realize, okay, there is a lot. It's clear, as you are mentioning. I mean, it is true that even in Faust there may be some enormously awkward words with regard to women, for example. And it is true that in a lot of children books I was trained in, for example, I was socialized with, you find the notion Negro, neger, which is even worse than Negro. Negro is strange because Negro is a word which was, I think, also used by the African Americans for describing themselves. So, whereas neger is a typical, I think, a German word, probably only a German word for black persons. So where I grew up, and it was part also of the Nazi system, which one shouldn't forget. Yeah? So within the Nazi period, the word for black people was Neger, which makes one a little bit nervous, yeah? That, especially that linkage. So I was socialized in a period, 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s, when it was still normal to use the word Neger with reference to blacks, of which we had more than before because of the American army. And my mother and father were using it all the time, and we had some, there are even more absurd debates, yeah, because we have one Süßigkeit. What is Süßigkeit?
Sweetness.
Sweet. One sweet, sweetness, which is called Negerkuss, the kiss of the Neger, which is still existing. We still have it, and you can go into a konditorei and say, "I want a Negerkuss." So what's and now I think it is a very consequential step to prove whether we would like to overcome these notions within the literature to which children have access. But I agree to you that it can get absurd dimensions, like this one. I think it would be more consequent to leave it like it is, and either to learn children about why there is this word. You can simply make an annotation, yeah, or something like that. Or parents or teachers which are familiar with the whole debate can explain why it is there. I don't believe that it has any longer any negative effect. I think if by custom and habit the word is overrun, for example with the sweets, I think we should, I mean, not intentionally, not to forbid it by law, but I think in the future it will come out of practice. They will give it another name. They will slowly start, some more, some less, but it will be, at the end, it will not longer appear. I think to do it intentionally by law or even by forcing a certain publishing house is absurd. I completely agree with that. But I only want also to stress the fact that I think it's a very important move, yeah, and one shouldn't underestimate the importance of it.
Okay, thank you. There was another one.
So my question concerns the last part of your speech, and so my question is, to what extent or in which way is the response to the two historical challenges to democratic education or to education as such, this sought-after response to the challenges of digital revolution and heterogeneity of populations, in which way should it differ from, or in which way should it differ from support for the capitalist production? Because the cooperation, the horizontal cooperation, and the digital participation, I think are two means that actually do support the production of neoliberal subjectivities. So my question really is, in which way does your response to these two historical challenges differ from the reproduction of capitalism?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, but let me go one step back, because there is one step important to stress, which is before the level on which you place your question. Yeah? There is the struggle for how to understand educational practices today. This is an enormously heavy struggle, and it is led, as far as I can see, in almost all countries, all democratic countries. And the main question is, what is the main function and the main role of our public school system? And the problem at the moment is, as far as I can see it, that there is no longer a kind of consent within the population. because there is a growing majority of parents which obviously want the schools to be mainly playing the role of qualification, making their own children fit for the future war on the occupational market. That's a capitalist development. The problem is a lot of parents are for it. So it's not an easy thing to win. Yeah? So we have a lot of public debates about that. And not only that, I mean, what I can observe more and more, this is what makes Kant so interesting. What's now happening, at least in Germany, but I know it also from the United States, is that parents, probably because of the pressures of the neoliberal revolution of capitalist system, parents take more and more the opinion that schools are their property. It's not the property of the state, but it's something about which the parents have a say. Kant, and I quoted that only shortly, what Kant is saying is fantastic, and you find that quote. Kant is saying the schools are the system against the wish and the wills of the parents. That's Kant's idea already. He's saying, I think the quote is, schools have to break the intentions of parents. Yeah? So it's a fight about that. There's also this fight behind that, and you can observe it when you are a parent like me and your children are still going to school. You find it on meetings with parents in schools. There is the debate whether the teachers are seen as agents of the state or agents of the parents. Yeah? More and more parents think they can dictate the parents what to teach. It's absurd. Yeah? But we have all these debates. Within these debates, I think one should take the very strong position that schools are our means the democratic citizens' instrument for recreating democratic virtues. That's my position. One has to defend it in public, but it's not easy. I mean, it is not so, I only want to say it's not so that there is a capitalist industry or capitalist system which is bringing this all about us, the citizens. No, a lot of citizens are in favor of it. That makes it so complicated. And therefore, this debate is so important, and one should re-politicize these questions, because they are, and I think it's a big mistake of political philosophy not to engage in that discussion. Yeah. So, if we take that position, of which I don't know whether it's a minority position right now or not, if you take that position that schools are the instruments we, the public democratic sphere, created for recreating ourselves, let's say, namely the democratic public sphere, or the democratic people, then the consequences are relatively clear. It means something with regard to the teaching methods and to the curricula. The teaching methods then should be cooperative, not so much based on individual assessment and individual qualifications, but really cooperative. The Finnish system is very ahead of that, yeah, and very good with all this. There you don't have individual accomplishments. You only have the accomplishments of a whole group. The individual accomplishment does not even count. So if you have all that, if you should have all that, then teaching about and observing the digital instrument would take a completely different form. It would take the form of a communal. I try to elaborate it after John Dewey. When Dewey is talking about, and he's very precise on that, about specific school disciplines. Yeah, for example, geography and history, his main disciplines. What he's saying is, It will be a cooperative investigation into the possibility and limits of one media. That's what I think of. Yeah? It will be, for example, as I said, not using Wikipedia for one's own qualification and for one's own, let's say, cognitive qualification. But it will mean to cooperatively in a school class test and prove how is Wikipedia constructed, what are the ways by which the articles at the end appear on the screen, what are the internal structures of the production, to what degree can we use it, where do we have to be very cautious with the results of Wikipedia. So what I think of is to take Wikipedia as, because of its actual importance, as an object in which a group of pupils is investigating and doing research on the different levels. Yeah, I mean, if you are 8 years old, the ways of interrogation and of investigation will be different to when you are 12 or when you are 17. Yeah. With 17, you can do real fantastic research together on Wikipedia. So what I don't believe is that we should simply learn pupils to use Wikipedia or to use the internet. That would be leading in the direction you were mentioning. That would be simply contributing to qualification and to preparing for the occupational market or the labor market. No, what I want to do is to take this new object, which the school shouldn't leave out, as a possible object of cooperative investigation. Because that's the main idea behind the whole thing. Yeah? If we take schools as being the most important part of our democratic system, and I still believe that, yeah? If we have an instrument at all for reproducing democracy, it is the school, the public school. Then it would be so that the teaching methods and the curricula should be structured after the idea of civic cooperation. That also means, with respect to the internet should be investigated together, cooperatively, as a kind of research field. And you can do it on different educational levels, I think, and with different ideas. I think it needs much more fantasy for teachers to come up with new teaching methods of that kind, cooperation. But then you see all the problems. Teachers are underpaid. Schools are badly financed. If you once had the chance to see a good American high school, you get an impression of how good schools can be. Because there are fantastic public schools where you have small cities and very high educated cities. Fantastic high schools with a lot of money. And you suddenly, and they are very affirmative, they are a little bit cooperative, and like those schools in Finland. Finland is a rich country, rich schools, overfinanced, and so on and so on. So the problems start very early, yeah? Namely where we are not creating the right kind of teachers, sometimes underqualified. We don't have a very good educational university system for teachers. Teachers themselves are underpaid. Schools are underpaid, and so on and so on. So a lot of negative factors along the way to think of schools as being democratic organs, like Dewey wanted it.
Okay. Our time limit is over, but we may allow one quick question, if you wish. Here you go.
Do you think that this debate on the nature of education in the 21st century can be actually solved approaching it from the perspective of thinkers inspired by Kant and this whole lineage who are profoundly informed by the Cartesian and Newtonian understanding of reality? Do you think that this debate, which is actually just one of many debates, which is convulsing the all Western and actually global culture can be solved from this limited perspective, or if you see that these particular problems which are manifesting in actually all spheres of human activities have to be approached from much wider, much more complex perspective, which actually allows to see deeper problems which are underlying and informing all these symptoms which are appearing in all spheres of human activities. Do you think it is possible to solve it only from this perspective, or do you see some need from a perspective which is much more complex, much more multivalent, much more multidimensional, etc.?
Yeah, it depends a little bit what you mean with the last words, yeah? Multi-dimensional or something like that. No, what I believe is, I mean, let me first say, sure, what I believe is that there may be other cultural traditions of a completely different kind in which you find similar ideas. Yeah? This, what I'm taking up, is a Western perspective. There may be other perspectives within the world having the same kind of potentialities for my own argument and for these debates. What I still believe is that the thinkers I was referring to, because they were struggling very deeply with the whole idea of education, if you only take Kant, how seriously he was engaged in the question, is it possible at all to educate a child which has the paradoxical task, or includes the paradoxical task, to lead somebody to autonomy by non-autonomous instruments. That's Kant's question. So this is a very deep question, and I don't believe that any kind of pedagogical discussion today reaches that kind of deepness and radicality with which Kant addressed the question. The same may be true for Dewey. I think Dewey, in a very radical way, and in a better way than a lot of much more technically skilled debates today, are addressing the question. Dewey is addressing the question how to think about educational practices. What are educational practices? It's almost for him a conceptual question, yeah? How to think about these? What does it mean, and how hangs it together with the epistemological question, how to think about thinking, yeah? What is thinking? And because thinking is for him a cooperative enterprise, therefore he believes that also teaching should be a cooperative enterprise. Teaching mirrors the structure of that epistemic practice by which we disclose the world. That's a very fundamental position. So what you have there in the tradition I was referring to is not only answers on a surface level to these questions, but you find in the background of these thinkers, you find, therefore they are philosophers, I have to say, you find answers which have to do with their own conception of epistemology and practical philosophy. So the most deep answers we can think of, I think, because they are prepared not only on the, how shall I say that, not on the surface of how to think about didactics or how to think about instruments, but how to think about the human being in its own environment. And the educational ideas they develop are a result of how they think almost metaphysically about our role in nature. And therefore I believe that these theories will survive the future, like Plato is surviving. Why shouldn't... I mean, you see, I don't believe that we will overcome Aristotle or Plato, even when the world is highly and much more technically developed, and we have developed much more technical disciplines and so on and so on. Why is it that we always come back to Aristotle? Why is it that Kant I mean, obviously is not dying, even when others may say that his answers are not longer fitting to the technical world in which we are living. I think because their answers are, to a certain degree, more radical because they are interrelated and connected with a view on our place in nature. And that makes them so worthwhile. And that, I think, is true for all the authors I mentioned. And that's what makes them even important today. And I think, no, we can't get rid of them, we shouldn't get rid of them, we should use them in order to solve these enormously difficult problems. Yeah? Even when a parent is coming to me and telling me, look, schools should be much more for the qualification of my pupil, I could come up, not with quoting Kant, but with some of his ideas. I'm sure of that.
Okay, I am sorry I have to finish this part of our conference, but on the other hand, this is my pleasure to thank Professor Honneth again, and especially we pragmatists, and there are some of us, I hope, in this room, are delighted with your frequent references to John Dewey. So, thank you again. It's been our honor to have you here, and we look forward to some other visits if you are in Bratislava.
Thank you very much.